Good evening, and welcome to the University of Calgary's annual Lecture of a Lifetime event. My name is Kieran Grant, and I'm pleased to be here today as your Master of Ceremonies. Currently, I'm a second-year medical student at the University of Toronto, but I'm thrilled to be back here in my hometown of Calgary. I spent my undergraduate years here at the University of Calgary and had the privilege of learning from many distinguished professors, including tonight's speaker, Dr. Glenda MacQueen. Dr. MacQueen and I first met when she agreed to help me with an initiative for student-run peer support service on campus in an effort to bolster the student mental health care that was available. Not only did she take the time to meet with a first-year student, despite her many responsibilities as a physician, scientist, vice dean, you guys all know, but she continued to actively mentor and support me over the next 3 years as we took a simple idea into a pilot project and ultimately one of the many great services that are offered out of the campus community hub in the Yamnuska Hall residence just down the hall, or down the road, I should say. I was also fortunate enough to learn from Glenda in science as one of her researchers in her labs and in advocacy work for youth mental health with the Ministries of Health and Advanced Education at the Alberta government. Dr. MacQueen even went so far as to send me all the way to Melbourne, Australia to collaborate with some of her colleagues, which was a transformational experience for me and probably a pretty good break for her as well. This is all to say that she's been really instrumental in shaping who I am and, much more importantly, the landscape of youth mental health services in our province and beyond. For those reasons, I'm honored to be here today as our Master of Ceremonies for what promises to be an incredible evening. Before we get started, I would just like to do an acknowledgement of the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kenai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, which is comprised of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is, of course, also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And I'd also like to welcome a number of special guests who are here in attendance this evening. Her Honor, the Honorable Lois Mitchell, Lieutenant Governor of Alberta, Chancellor Emeritus Bill Warren, Chancellor Emeritus Jim Dinning, former Board of Governors Chair Bonnie DuPont, President Emeritus Terry White, Chancellor Deborah Yedlin, President and Vice Chancellor Dr. Ed McCauley, members of the University of Calgary Board of Governors, Alumni Board of Directors and Senate, and I'd like to welcome as well members of the university's senior leadership and members of our Students' Union and Graduate Students Association. Of course, an extra special welcome to close friends and family of Dr. MacQueen who are able to be here tonight. And last but not least, a warm welcome to all students, faculty, staff, alumni, and of course our valued community partners and leaders who are all able to make it out here tonight. Just before we get started, a quick note on safety. So in case of an emergency, we'd ask that we'd all please calmly exit through these 6 exits around the perimeter of the room that you can see. This will be facilitated by event staff and our university fire wardens, so you can follow their directions to our muster point, which is the Food Court of Science B. Once there, you can remain and wait patiently until given further instruction about when it's safe to return to the building. Okay, so an introduction to this Lecture of a Lifetime event. Lecture of a Lifetime was introduced by the University Senate 11 years ago, and with the purpose of showcasing the talents and achievements of leading University of Calgary academics and celebrating their outstanding service to the university, its students, and most importantly, the greater community. Lecture of a Lifetime as a concept was inspired by Dr. Randy Posh's widely publicized last lecture, which he gave at Carnegie Mellon University in 2007. I am thrilled to be part of such a fantastic community event, and I'm so pleased that you are all able to join us here tonight for which is sure to be a captivating and informative evening with Dr. Glenda MacQueen. I would now like to invite Deborah Yedlin, Chancellor of the University of Calgary, to the stage to share a few quick words.
Thank you, Kieran, and good evening, everyone. My name is Deborah Yedlin, and I am very proud to be the University of Calgary's Chancellor. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Glenda MacQueen, who will be discussing mental health research in the shadow of neuroscience. Everyone in this room is impacted by mental health. Whether we have personally suffered or seen others around us, family, friends, coworkers, affected by depression, addiction, anxiety, bipolar disorders. Mental health touches all of us. My mother lost all but her parents during World War II. She became an accomplished academic in her adopted country, and yet she suffered from tremendous anxiety, which my brother and I acutely felt, and which has impacted both of us. Being of a certain generation, she didn't seek help. It was attributed to being a survivor of the war and all that came with it. Who could possibly help? Mental health issues continue to hide in the corners of society. They are the whispers behind doors, in corridors, and rarely aired out in the open. In her own way, my mother hid too. And that's why tonight's topic that will be addressed by Dr. MacQueen personally resonates with me, and is one that I see as being one more step in changing the dialogue and understanding of mental health in our community. I want to thank the groups that were here tonight during the reception who took the time to talk to us about the important work they are doing within the sphere of mental health and the brain. The Matheson Center, UCalgary Campus Mental Health Strategy, the Imagine Project, the Mylan Study, the Palix Foundation, Alberta Health Services Access to Mental Health Program, and the Calgary Counseling Center. As a university, we have made a bold commitment to the mental health and well-being of our university family through the Campus Mental Health Strategy. Every year, we support new programs, educational opportunities, and initiatives. Together, with your support, we are creating a community of caring. By being here tonight, you are part of the movement to change the discussion, to eliminate the stigma, to bring the mental health discussion out of the corners of society and into the open. Thank you for coming to tonight's Lecture of a Lifetime.
Thank you, Chancellor Yedlin, for those great words. I'd now like to invite Dr. Ed McCauley, President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Calgary, to the stage.
Thanks, Karen. Really appreciate it. Good evening and welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many distinguished guests and friends here tonight, as Karen has noted. But I want to give a special shout out to Glenda, to Alex, to Ali, Emily, and Mark. Thank you for being here. The Lecture of a Lifetime is one of the events of the season at the University of Calgary, and there's a very good reason why. This is a fantastic opportunity for our university to reach out to the wider community and share the work of our incredible thought leaders right here in the city. We've heard from a number of extraordinary innovators at the Lecture of Lifetime series over the years, and this is a direct product of the hard work of the Lecture Selection Committee and the team in the Senate's office, so I'd like to thank them for making this program such a success. They've established a tradition of excellence at the University of Calgary for the Lecture of a Lifetime series, so thank you very much. And of course, tonight's speaker is no exception to that rule. Dr. Glenda MacQueen epitomizes the values that define great innovators as individuals and great research universities as world-class institutions. She is about excellence. She is about positive impact, and she is about compassion. And her contributions have enriched our community in innumerable ways. Dean Meddings will provide a more fulsome introduction, so I will just touch on a few highlights of Glenda's leadership. And Glenda, it is a true honor for me to be here recognizing your leadership. On our campus, she is an inspiring scholar, mentor, and colleague, encouraging many of our students, as you've heard from Kieran, to strive for excellence through her service as the Vice Dean of the Cumming School of Medicine, among many, many other roles here. In our province, she has made a tremendous impact, including her work with Alberta Health Services as the first Senior Medical Director of the Addiction and Mental Health Strategic Clinical Network. And across Canada, Glenda is a champion for mental health and wellness, sharing her expertise as part of the Board of Directors for the Palix Foundation and numerous other national organizations. The University of Calgary is committed to delivering new knowledge and innovations that improve quality of life in our society. And it is through the tireless efforts of leaders like Glenda, that we are delivering on this commitment. So, on behalf of our university family, Glenda, I'd like to thank you for the work you do. I also, however, want to acknowledge the wider community that makes this work possible. Through your support, our students and our scholars are able to rally around the grand challenges in society, including those related to brain and mental health. We are mobilizing our knowledge to identify solutions, and we're fostering a renewed sense of hope for the individuals and families affected by these challenges. It's a privilege to be able to do this, and we are grateful to the many champions that allow our university to make a difference in the world. Thank you very much. It's going to be a memorable evening.
Thank you, President Macaulay. At this time, I'd like to invite Dr. John Meddings, Dean of the Cumming School of Medicine here at the University of Calgary, to introduce our 2019 Lecture of a Lifetime speaker, Dr. Glenda MacQueen.
So thank you, Kieran. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Chancellor Yedlin. Ladies and gentlemen, you know, there's a lot of things about this world that I don't know. But one thing I do know is that we're in for an incredible treat tonight. We've got a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity here to listen to a talk about an area that, as Deborah Yedlin has said, affects all of us, but a talk given by somebody who is a true world expert in the field. I'm sure all of you have read Glenda MacQueen's bio. Ed has referred to some of her incredible accomplishments, and I could spend a long time reading them to you. I'm not, don't worry, not going to do that. But I do want to point out that Glenda is truly one of the top scientists in the world in this field. And I want to expand on that a little bit. What does it mean to be a top scientist in the world? I mean, in some ways, it rolls off my tongue pretty glibly. I could easily just say that it's true. Trust me, I'm a doctor and all that. I mean, but there's a little more to it than that. Glenda is what all of the world's scientists collectively agree is one of our very best. So how do we arrive at that? So I just want to explain that a little bit, because I think it's important to understand. When we as scientists generate new knowledge and we communicate it to the world, we're always careful to frame new knowledge in the context of what we already know. We carefully quote the work that has gone before that has been significant, and the more important the work that has gone before, the more often it is cited. So scientists who've done many, many groundbreaking things are going to be cited more frequently than scientists who haven't done as many. Stands to reason. And in the end, the number of citations that a scientist gets is a reasonable, imperfect in some ways, but it's a reasonable reflection of how good other scientists think they are. Simple. So every year, Thomson Reuters analyzes all the citations done by all the scientists across the world. They count how many times every scientist in the world has been cited. And they rank them all the way from those who've never been cited at all to the other end, people who have been cited a whole pile of times. And the top 1% of that group in the world, by any estimation, is a group of people who the world scientists collectively consider our very best. Glenda is a member of that rarefied group. She's one of the top 1% of the world's cited scientists. Now, isn't that pretty amazing? Pretty incredible. But I have to tell you, that's not why I love having Glenda as the Vice Dean of the Cumming School of Medicine. I mean, it's a pretty darn good reason. I got to give it that. But to me, it severely underestimates the impact that Glenda has had upon me, the Cumming School of Medicine, and the University of Calgary. And to illustrate that, I want to share two stories with you. They're short, but important. The first is I want to tell you a little story about how Glenda became the Vice Dean of the Cumming School of Medicine. Because interestingly, when I took this job on as Dean 7 years ago, I did not know Glenda MacQueen. It It was a bit of a shock. I had been away in Edmonton when Glenda had been recruited from McMaster to Calgary as the head of psychiatry. And before I took this role on, she had been recruited away from the University of Calgary into Alberta Health Services to start the Strategic Clinical Network. We had never met. And so when I took this job on, one of the first things I recognized that I had to do, and I had to do really well, is I had to pick an incredible leadership team. And there were two groups of people that I had to pick. The first were a group of senior leaders in research and education, and the second was a vice dean. And I knew that for a vice dean, I wanted someone who could work on all sorts of levels, someone who had an incredible way with people, who thought about things in a way that complemented the way I thought about them but didn't mirror them, and someone who I could completely trust. And I have to tell you, I had no idea who that person was going to be. So like most administrators, I took the easy route. I said, I'm going to defer that decision. I'll pick the other two groups. So we set about doing that. And we advertised for those roles, and I wanted a very small but very smart selection committee to help me interview and pick those senior leaders. And I had some people in place who already could do this, but I wanted some advice from people in our faculty. I wanted some wisdom from outside the leadership role. And I specifically wanted to have someone who had exceptional insights into people, into personalities, and how teams of people worked. So I asked for advice around the School of Medicine as to who could do this for me. And one name kept coming up, Glenda MacQueen. I didn't know her, but boy, did she come highly recommended. So one day I plucked up my courage and I called Glenda and asked whether she would do this. Yes, she said. I have to tell you, going through the interviews was an unbelievable experience. First, for the caliber of people who had applied for those roles and who we ultimately picked, but also for my observations of Glenda. She was amazing. In a few short questions in an interview, Glenda could get at the heart of a person's skill set. She had incredible insight into personality and incredible insight into how team dynamics would work. She was a brilliant researcher, she understood universities, and she had big dreams for our school. I was in awe of Glenda MacQueen at that point. So on the last night of our interview process, after we had selected the team, and I think it was 7 or 8 o'clock at night, I remember it was quite late, I asked Glenda to stay behind after everyone had left because I wanted to thank her. I wanted to thank her for the incredible work that she had done and the real work that she'd given me in helping put together what is truly an amazing leadership team. And as I was doing that, it slowly dawned on me that all those qualities that I was thanking Glenda for were exactly what I had wanted in a vice dean. And so out of my mouth tumbled the words, Glenda, would you consider being my vice dean? I hadn't really thought it through. I'm sure I could have asked it in a much better way, but you couldn't believe how grateful I was when she gave me that rather considered look that I now know well, where Glenda will just cock her head a little to the side, look at you out of the corner of her eyes, and she said, yes, I think that would be lovely. That was one of the best days of my life. So over the last 7 years, little bits of Glenda have rubbed off on all of us in the Cumming School of Medicine. And I have to tell you, we are vastly better off for it. There's been no shortage of success stories for the Cumming School of Medicine, and I'm not going to elaborate on any of them, but suffice to say, I can't think of one of them that doesn't have Glenda's fingerprints all over it. One final story, short. When I leave town, Glenda does both our jobs. One of the meetings I go to is called the AFMC, where the deans of all of Canada's 17 medical schools get together. It's an interesting group. The old joke is that a single room holding 17 medical school deans is for any university provost or university president the quintessential definition of hell. It's a mixture of interesting personalities. And I remember one meeting a few years ago when we had gone for dinner, And one particular dean, who I won't name, was complaining in a rather awful way. He, and it most definitely was a he, felt that he could not leave town, as he said, because when I do, everything goes to hell in a handbasket. There's nobody who can manage things. And although I truly believe that he wanted sympathy and commiseration, I have to say I was compelled to say, you know, I have exactly the same problem, although it's a little different. When I leave town, my vice dean takes over, and so I feel I have to limit my time away because I don't want people getting too used to the upgrade. And that's Glenda. Glenda is an amazing and lovely person. She is truly a world-renowned scientist. She's an incredibly capable and charismatic leader. She's been instrumental in transforming almost all aspects of the Cumming School of Medicine. And I have to say, she is someone I'm profoundly grateful to for saying yes to me 7 years ago, almost to the day, Glenda. Most of all, I have to say, I'm simply incredibly proud to call Glenda my friend. So welcome, Glenda.
I have always wondered how I got that job. Now I know. Let me get organized. Thank you, Chancellor and members of the Senate, for this opportunity. And thank you, Bev and John, for sponsoring this submission. And I have no adequate way to express my gratitude for the fact that John did, in fact, allow me to become his vice dean, and opened up a world of opportunity at the University of Calgary, where I've had the chance to work with so many wonderful people, many of whom are here in this room. And it's possibly one of the best experiences in life to get up every day and feel privileged to go to work. And that's what you have offered to me, so I thank you for that. I also want to thank all of you for being here. And I can't adequately express my gratitude for that either. But as Chancellor Yedlin has noted, this is important. Much more important than the fact that I'm here is the fact that you are here. Because it would be only a generation ago that nobody wanted to talk about mental health. And it is still a taboo topic in many parts of the world. So I feel very fortunate that we can gather together this evening on a campus that not only talks the talk about mental health, but is also walking the walk. And as has already been noted, tonight we are all part of that journey. Several people who have been part of this Lecture of a Lifetime series they've noted that it's been challenging to prepare for the event, and I am no exception. Most of the previous presenters have had fascinating and eloquent stories and metaphors. Gayla had a tapestry that described how they were called for their chosen profession. I have a simple story. When I was about 7 years old, I had a gym teacher. She was a formidable woman. And she once tasked us with drawing a picture of what we wanted to be when we grew up. Being 7, I hadn't really nailed that down, and I couldn't particularly draw. But at the time, I had a cute tutu and a picture book with dancers in it. And I could more or less copy the dancers onto the paper. So I said, a ballerina. As my gym teacher, she had already had an opportunity to assess my motor skills. And so in response, she said, how about a doctor? So the next Christmas, I asked Santa for a chemistry set and a microscope. And at the time, it didn't strike me as odd that along with the microscope, Santa brought a box of beautifully labeled pathology slides from the Glace Bay General Hospital. Real blood and tissue. It was the best. And a series of more or less connected dots takes us from then to this evening. Now, one sleepless night, I realized that my unremarkable life was not the only challenge that I faced this evening, because I want to talk to you about two things that are at the core of my professional experience. One is psychiatry, and the other is clinical research. And I would like to convince you this evening that psychiatric research is an exciting and dynamic field. But even I have to admit that psychiatry doesn't always easily lend itself to edge-of-the-seat medical drama. Most days, people say, "What did you do in clinic?" And I can only reply, "I listened, I talked, we made a plan." It's similar for clinical research. We have few aha or epiphanal moments. Instead, it usually involves years of data collection, some of you know that well, followed by careful checking, cleaning, and analyzing the data. And eventually, we submit our precious paper and wait for a heartless journal editor to decide the fate of 5 years of our lives. But embedded in what may sound mundane is the privilege of working with patients as partners who share our commitment to make things better for the next generation. These days, patients who were once on the fringes of society and psychiatrists who still are a little bit on the fringes of medicine, we can come together using some of the most powerful tools in science. And tonight, I want us to think about some of the ways in which these technologies are shaping the future of psychiatric research. But in order to understand where the field is going, I think it might be helpful for us to take a look at where we've been. Who is this? Descartes, thank you. It would have been more impressive if his name hadn't been on the title slide for 5 minutes, but still good. When most of us think of Descartes, it's probably as a philosopher or perhaps as a scientist. Descartes considered himself a health researcher. And in 1645, he wrote that the preservation of health has always been the principal end of my studies. And there's speculation that when he first proposed the mind-body dichotomy that carries his name as Cartesian dualism, he did it in part because he was interested in studying the body and didn't want to be seen to be meddling with affairs of the mind, which at that time was interchangeable with soul and therefore the jurisdiction of the church. Today, when we speak of mind, we usually don't mean something synonymous with the concept of an eternal soul. In fact, these days when we refer to mind and body, we often will add "and soul" or "spirit." Tonight, we'll focus on the mind and brain and the body, but the soul is for a different jurisdiction. And although Cartesian dualism has permeated Western medicine for most of the last 400 years, Descartes himself had no compelling explanation for how the body and the mind, one physical, one not, were supposed to interact. And in fact, there's a wonderful exchange of letters between Descartes and Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. And she was writing to him, and she said essentially, "You know, Descartes, I can't follow this mind-body distinction and how it's all supposed to come together." And lacking a good explanation, he eventually replied to her and essentially said, "Princess, thinking is really hard work, and it's dangerous to do too much of it." But although Descartes' work has been so influential that he has sometimes been called the father of modernism, when it comes to dualism, the 25-year-old princess had him on the run. Now, let's fast forward to the turn of the 20th century. And I'm not sure, does anybody recognize who these characters are? Pavlov and Freud. Thank you. So you can see, unbeknownst to most students of psychology, Pavlov's first experiment was to ring his bell and cause his dog to attack Freud's cat. This cartoon pretty much captures my life when I began psychiatry. Prior to medicine, I completed a PhD in a traditional school of behaviorism that was the dominant model of experimental psychology for most of the 20th century. And in contrast, psychiatry had been dominated by Freudian psychoanalytical models. There was virtually no overlap between experimental psychology and clinical psychiatry, and arguably there was little progress in psychiatric research. Psychiatry had no material connection to a foundational science that could have driven a research agenda, as neither experimental psychology nor basic neuroscience were widely considered relevant for the clinical practice of psychiatry. But in the 1980s, things began to change. Cognitive neuroscience began to replace behaviorism as the major force in experimental psychology. It had a focus on human studies and an interest in linking cognition and emotions to the human brain. Psychiatry was also beginning to consider the brain as a relevant organ. Like the rest of medicine, psychiatry had entered the era of large clinical trials, evidence-based medicine, and a subdiscipline of biological psychiatry emerged. I was hopeful that biological psychiatry might help us to put the mind back into the brain. And as an experimental psychologist, I was very interested in this idea that perhaps we could use tools from cognitive science to tackle some of the challenges in psychiatry. Now, unless we get too optimistic about psychiatry's ability to consign Cartesian dualism to the dustbin of history, as recently as 2015, the former head of the NIMH, Tom Insel, wrote, "Labels invite continual recapitulation of the fruitless mind, body, and nature-nurture debates that have impeded a deeper understanding of psychopathology." So psychiatry had entered the era of neuroscience, carrying its historical baggage along with it. Nonetheless, I was interested in studying cognitive tools and their application to psychiatric illness. And because we're going to talk about that, I have some simple tasks to give you a sense of what they're like. And here's a list of unrelated words that I would like you to read just to yourself, ideally twice, and I'll read them in case in the back they're not clear. So we have face, radio, tulip, library, and green. That's face, radio, tulip, library, and green. I'm making this easy, so nobody pull out the phone and take a picture of the screen. You don't need to make notes. But I would ask you to just memorize those words in the old-fashioned way. Keep them in mind for later. And now we're going to move to another cognitive task that many of you have probably seen. Anybody remember what this one is called? Stroop. Yes, thank you. So this task requires you to name the color of the ink in which the word is written. Don't read the word. And so we're going to try to do this together, and we'll start up here. So what ink color is this? Color, 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 color. Okay, you guys are way too good at it. Let's try it again. Go ahead, ink color. Okay, it's a little bit harder. And that's the Stroop effect. It's harder because you have to inhibit your overriding and overlearned tendency to read a word in order to name the ink color. Now, the reason for me to ask you to complete the Stroop task is not just to try to keep you awake after the long day. It is so that you can feel the importance of inhibition in attention, and so that you'll have an idea that attention is not just the ability to shine a spotlight on a target. It's also necessary to be able to dim the lights on competing information. Now, what's harder to appreciate is that embedded in this task is a phenomenon called negative priming. And if we had millisecond timing of your responses, we would be able to appreciate that you would be slower to respond on a few words. And the idea is this. In this trial, you have to inhibit the word orange in order to say the ink color black. On the next trial, you can think of it like pulling back the word orange in order to answer correctly for the ink color. Same in these trials. Here you have to say the word green, or say the ink color green, and inhibit blue, which is the ink color on the next trial. So you would be slower to say orange and to say blue than on other unrelated trials. So it's called negative priming because one trial primes or prepares you for the next, and negative because the effect is to make us slower. Now, this is one of the original negative priming tasks that was developed by a colleague of mine named Steve Tipper, who's a cognitive scientist who hired me as a research assistant when I was an undergraduate. So I've been familiar with this task for a long time. And eventually I became interested in using negative priming as a way to study problems of inhibitory control in people with depression. So there's that movement towards applying some of these tasks to study psychiatric illness. You will know, some of you will know, that problems with concentration and focus are written into the very diagnosis of depression. And people who have depression will often report feeling unfocused, distracted. They'll report they have difficulty attending to a task. But at the time we first started working with negative priming, there were almost no studies examining whether these concentration problems might be in part because of reduced inhibitory control. So we simply asked a group of people who had depression to complete the negative priming task for us. And it's pretty simple compared to the Stroop. You just name the target that's in red, so scissors, scissors and cup, but here or scissors and bed, and here you've had to inhibit bed, and you would be a little bit slower on this task. And sure enough, people who had depression were actually faster on the task. They were faster because they lacked the inhibitory control that should have jumped into action to help inhibit bed and allow them to say scissors. Now that was a very simple finding, but it did lead us to ask a number of questions about the impact of depression on cognitive systems in the brain. We wanted to move on and study that in more detail, but in order to do that, we needed a slightly different task, one that we could make a little bit more challenging. So we moved to something called a backward masking task. Now, masking is pretty simple. If you were working on a computer screen, and what you would see is that I would flash a target at you very quickly. And here it's the letter P. These dotted lines represent the passage of time, not a long time, maybe 100 milliseconds. And if I gave you 100 milliseconds before I replaced the P with an X or a mask or a distractor, you would find the task easy to do. And I would have set it up, except the timing of moving between the screens doesn't work very well. It has to be really fast. We can make this task difficult simply by shortening up the interval between the target and the mask. And so if we make that interval really short, you just don't have enough time to process the target before it's masked. Now, you might say to us, well, what was the big deal with a difficult task? Why were you interested in that? At the time, the clinic where I was working was becoming interested in studying young people who were experiencing first episodes of depression. And we and others knew that about 75% of all psychiatric illness will begin before the age of 25. But surprisingly few clinics were either treating or studying young adults around the time they first experienced illness. And we thought if we were going to study this group, and examine whether they might have some cognitive problems, they were more likely to be apparent if we had a more difficult task. We need the slide. There we go, thanks. Here, what you're seeing, and I'm just going to walk you through this, is reaction times and error rates. And reaction times are about half a second. This is a really fast task. And error rates here vary, but if you look on this side of the screen, you can see that all of our groups have quite low error rates, and you probably can't read that, but that's 5%. So the error rates for all groups when the task is easy were very low. So we did, in fact, need to have a more challenging task. And what's happening here is the interval between target and mask is getting short, so the task is getting harder, and here you start seeing our groups separate. Now, who's in this group? This is a group of young people. Some of the young people, represented in pink, had no symptoms ever of psychiatric illness and no family history. Another group, represented in the kind of purple color, had no symptoms ever of depression, but they did have a positive family history. So they carried some genetic liability for a mood disorder. The group in green were also young people who had had some symptoms of depression in the past, but at the time that we assessed them, they didn't have any symptoms. So they were what we would call euthymic, or essentially well. And we were startled by the difference that emerged when our task was difficult. So if you can read here, our young, healthy people, when the task was hard, hit error rates of maybe 8 to 10%. But the young people who had, in past, experienced some symptoms of depression were at error rates 3 times that, and they were slower. So they found that component of the task really challenging. And this surprised us in part because, remember, at the time that we assessed them, they didn't have any symptoms of depression. So that suggested to us that those first early symptoms of depression were leaving some kind of an imprint on the neural circuitry that underlied this task. It also suggested to us that there might be a window of time that was important for us to understand before the first onset of depression, because we didn't really know whether this deficit could be recovered after the depression had occurred. So we became even more interested in studying what happens in that period leading up to and including that first episode of depression. And to explain where we went next, we have to talk a little bit about memory. And just to prepare you, we're going to come back to those words that you memorized. So memory is not a unitary concept. There are multiple memory systems. And the easiest way to divide them up is to think of habit or automatic or overlearned memories, and recollection memories, which are more the kind of little checklist, the details you have to keep in your mind for a particular event or item. And an easy way to think about it is if you have your own parking spot, and you park your car every day in that parking spot, if you were to have depression and to have some cognitive problems, it is extremely unlikely that on one random day you would forget what your parking spot is, because that's an overlearned or habit memory. In contrast, for any of us, you know, if we arrive late one day and our parking spot's gone and we're a bit distracted and maybe we're on the phone, not that I would have ever done that, and we kind of have to drive around and find a place to park and we run out of the car and off to work. For some portion of us, when we come out into the parking garage that evening, we will be standing at our parking spot convinced that somebody has stolen our cars. And that is the difference between habit memory and recollection memory. And for people who have depression, that tendency to have errors in recollection memory is what's increased. And that can be very bothersome to people. Now, just take a moment and remind yourself of the words that we saw on the screen a few minutes ago. So there were 5 words. Just bring them back into your own mind. We don't need to shout them out. So you are now engaging in free recall. What about if I said, well, one of them was a flower, one's a color, one was a building, one is a device you use to listen to Chancellor Yedlin on CBC. That's cued recall, and that should be a little bit easier. And if not, I might say to you, well, one of them was a flower, and can you tell me whether it was a lilac or a tulip? And one was a color, and do you think it was green or yellow? And if none of those words sound at all familiar to you, we should talk about that a little bit later. So here's another example of recollection memory. It's the only joke I have, so if you've heard it before and you remember the punchline, feel free to shout it out at the appropriate time. So there's a health-focused couple of a certain age, and they go to their doctor to ask their physician how to keep their memories sharp, because everybody's interested in brain health and aging brains these days, so everybody wants their memories sharp. And the physician says, you know, I think your memories are fine, but if you have any concerns, you could always just try writing things down. That might help. And so they're actually happy enough with that explanation. They go home in that evening. The wife says, you know, I'd love a bowl of ice cream. And her husband graciously says, you know, I could get that for you. And she says, well, that's terrific, but do you need to write it down? And he's a bit irritated. He says, no. And she says, well, okay, but I'd like strawberries. And he says, yeah, I got it, strawberries and ice cream with whipped cream, but write it down. And now he's really irritated. And he says, look, it's strawberries, ice cream, and whipped cream. I've got it. He disappears to the kitchen. He's gone for 20 minutes. He finally comes back, and he hands her a plate of bacon and eggs. She looks at it, and she says, I told you to write it down. You forgot the toast. So that's recollection memory. Now, one of the things that's convenient for us about recollection memory is that it's highly dependent on the integrity of one brain region, the hippocampus. So we began to study the hippocampus in people with depression using MRI scans. And of course, we studied young people with their first episode of depression, and we also studied people who had had multiple past episodes of depression. And this is a functional MRI scan, so participants are actually in the scanner completing the recollection memory task. Now, I mentioned in the very beginning that clinical research is a partnership with patients. And for me, this is a good example, because we approach people who don't feel well, and we propose to them that it would be terrific if they would climb into the MRI scanner, which will be noisy and tight. And while they're in there, it'd be great if we could just run this recollection memory task, which they're probably going to find really hard, and we'd test their memory. And usually we say, and if you wouldn't mind, we'll just take a few, maybe 9 vials of blood. But the answer that we almost always receive in return is, I will do it if it will help someone else. So this really is a partnership. And here what we found when young people completed the task in the scanner for us was that they were actually quite good with recollection memory. And you can't see that here, but trust me on this one. They performed at the same level as healthy young people with no depression. When we looked at the hippocampus, what you're seeing in orange on this panel, there was actually more activity in the hippocampus than we would have expected. And so speaking loosely, it's as though the hippocampus could still do the task, but it had to recruit some extra help to get it done. It had to recruit local regions to support its performance. So that suggests maybe some vulnerability underlying, even though they were good on the task. Now, when we looked at people with multiple past episodes of depression, they actually were quite challenged by the task. And it was a hard task, and we saw lots of error rates. And perhaps corresponding to that, when we looked at activity in the hippocampus, we saw that it was reduced. And that's what you're seeing in blue. That means a relative decrease in activity for people with depression in comparison to people who don't have depression. So once again, we were faced with this idea that there might be a window of time where in a first episode of depression, the hippocampus could still be activated, but later on in illness, it couldn't. And so obviously, we're interested in how to prevent an active hippocampus from turning into an inactive hippocampus. Now, because the hippocampus is my favorite brain region, we didn't just study its functioning, we also examined its structure or its size. And it turns out that in some people with depression, it's smaller than would be predicted. When we first did this work, people often would say to us, wow, but yeah, maybe, but only by 5, maybe 9%. And that's true. But on the other hand, put your hand up if you want to volunteer to give up 5 to 9%, if any brain region. So most of us would hang on to that if we could. And you can anticipate, based on what we've been discussing, that we would have been interested in knowing what the hippocampus looked like when people came to their first episode of depression. So in other words, we were asking, is the teenage brain really shrinking? And for the most part, the answer seems to be no. And hippocampal volumes have now been measured in literally thousands of people across the world. There's a subset of people with a first episode of depression who have a very strong family history, and another subset who have a personal experience with trauma or significant anxiety. And that group may come to their first episode with a smaller hippocampal volume. But in general, the size of the hippocampus is pretty much in the normal range when the illness first begins. And this is the left and the right side of the hippocampus. But what we see here is that as the illness progresses and over time, there's a fall off in volume, and most of that occurs in the first few years of illness. And this makes sense because we wouldn't expect a linear relationship with a hippocampus just disappearing, but it seems to fall off, and after that fall off, things stabilize. We, of course, were interested in understanding whether we could do anything to prevent that decline. But you might say to me, well, having a slightly smaller hippocampus doesn't sound great, but does it actually relate to anything important? Maybe you just have a bit of extra hippocampal tissue and it doesn't matter. So we asked that question, we looked at that, and asked the question whether a small hippocampal volume would be related to whether or not a person would respond to treatment, to an antidepressant medication. And in this instance, it turns out that size really does matter. So here we see the posterior part of the hippocampus, and particularly in the back or posterior part of the hippocampus, if that area was small, people were much less likely to recover from their episode of illness. So again, we felt we wanted to think about how we would prevent illness progression. Now, one way to stop the progression of illness would be to treat everyone aggressively when we first have the opportunity. And there are some people who would advocate for that approach. Most of us, however, would probably argue for a different strategy because the majority of people with a first episode of depression will do just fine. For many people, it will resolve and it will never come back. Or it might come back, but it might be 20 years in the future. But there's a subset of people who develop a recurrent or chronic illness. So the question we really want to ask is among the group of people with depression, who are the ones at risk of recurrence? And as a follow-up to that, why are those brains different? And what can we do about it? Now, at this point, you might be thinking, wait, was that a reference to the right treatment for the right patient at the right time? Was that actually a reference to precision medicine? And in fact, it was. In 2017, Dr. George Weiss gave this lecture. And when he talked about the future, he talked about the future with precision medicine. 2 years later, I want to suggest to you that the future has arrived. And if you could read this, which I know is challenging, but you would see that right up on this screen. Because what it says is Alberta Precision Health for Rare Disease Summit, tomorrow at the Alberta Children's Hospital. The future is here. So we've heard many people say, I don't really get this precision medicine thing. And that's partly because it's not one thing. Precision medicine is a paradigm shift. And we usually only have paradigm shifts in medicine maybe every 30 years or so. But the key goals of precision medicine are the same goals that medicine has always had. We want to keep people healthy, and when people are not healthy, we want to help return them to health. We want people to get better. So the paradigm shift is not in our goals. The paradigm shift is in how we tackle those goals. And new technologies are driving this shift. Technology is also allowing for another key component, which is collaboration between large groups. And when large groups work collaboratively with new technologies, our hope is we can then begin to piece together the complex factors that determine why one person gets sick and another doesn't, or why one person gets well and another doesn't. So, what does precision psychiatry look like? Well, I would like to share with you 3 examples of precision research programs, all located at least in part in Calgary. And the first is a study led by Jean Addington, one of our renowned psychologists who's working at the Matheson Center. And when John very kindly mentioned that notion of a citation rate and they count up your citations, Jean is a top 1% psychologist, so renowned in her field. And Jean is leading a study to look at and get at this notion that when young people first begin to experience symptoms, they're usually undifferentiated. So they're distressed, they may be anxious, they may have a few symptoms of mood disorders, their performance might drop off in school. But generally, young people do not come in with labels stuck on their foreheads. So we don't know when they first arrive whether they will go on to develop depression, perhaps bipolar disorder, perhaps a psychotic illness, or perhaps nothing. Maybe it's just a bump on the road on an otherwise smooth highway to the future. So our goal is to use a variety of these new technologies, including some of the ones that you've been hearing about. So we look at a genetic risk, which you've heard a little bit about, brain activity, we have brain scans, we look at life experiences, and we get them to do cognitive assessments. And the hope is that when we put these things together, we will be able to separate adolescents into groups that predict the trajectory that they will take. So our goal is to get to a future in which families can ask us, what is this, what's going to happen next, and what can you do about it? And we can give them a better answer than we can today. Now, we're talking about the hippocampus. This is a picture of hippocampus, and Nikita is here somewhere. I don't want to put Nikita on the spot, but you could wave, Nikita. Thank you. So this is Nikita's work. He's one of our terrific graduate students, and he's really taken technology in a new way for us. So this is looking at the hippocampus of some young people in ProCan, that study I just mentioned, and a variety of other participants. And what you're seeing is essentially the hippocampus traced by both some of our excellent students, and I actually think Kieran had the great privilege of moving through some hippocampal volume tracing, and you have a long legacy because Dr. Val Taylor, who's our new superstar department head of psychiatry, Val herself once moved through the experience of tracing the hippocampus. So our students have done this at the gold standard level for many years, but it takes a long time. To do it well probably takes at least an hour a scan, and usually we need multiple raters in order to trust the result. What Nikita found is a computer algorithm that can also trace hippocampal volumes. And if you can see the little bright green dots, those are the only areas where our expert raters and the computer disagreed. So without getting into the details, this is a computer algorithm that can reliably measure a hippocampus in about 30 seconds. So once this program is configured, we can do in an afternoon, or I should say Nikita can do in an afternoon, what would have taken 6 months of human effort. And suddenly, it's much easier to assess large numbers of people. Now, this is another example also from ProCan and also data generated by Nikita. And you might remember earlier I mentioned that in one of our studies, it was the tail of the hippocampus that seemed to be particularly important in predicting recovery from depression. And here what Nikita is using is a different computer algorithm that will automatically parcellate the hippocampus into a variety of functionally distinct subregions. And this is the hippocampus. These are related structures, the amygdala and the thalamus. Now, with manual tracing, we can essentially divide the hippocampus into 2 or maybe 3 regions. You can see that with this algorithm, we can get close to 20 subregions. And so the idea is that when we look for the earliest changes in the hippocampus, changes that we might never detect in the entire structure, we may be able to start seeing them when we can look at the very tiny subregions and assess them one by one. This is another precision psychiatry depression network. And this group is a good example of collaboration. So it's a group of us who have worked together for a long time, and we are a coast-to-coast network that's focused on studying depression. With the technology we now have, we can, for example, have a participant complete a scan, an MRI scan, at UBC. We can translate that data almost immediately to Queen's, where it's uploaded on the Queen's high-performance computing platform. At the same time, our research assistant in Calgary can log into that Queen's platform, review the scan, and send information back to UBC and to the coordinating site in Toronto regarding the quality of that scan. So technology is allowing for collaboration between groups that has just never been feasible before. And this particular network is interested in this notion that we need to do better to match patients with treatments. So we're using a variety of the same measures you've now heard a few times: clinical scans, cognitive assessments, imaging markers, genetic, molecular factors. But the idea is that if we can put these things together in the right way, we may be able to understand different phenotypes or types of depression in such a way that we can match a person with the best treatment for them right off the bat. And that could be a medication, a talk therapy, or even a neurostimulation therapy. But the idea is to match them up so we get maximal effectiveness early. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, this sounds a bit simple-minded. And isn't that what you've always been doing? Isn't selecting treatments for patients what you do every day? And the answer is, in some ways, not exactly. So much like the rest of medicine, the common approach in psychiatry for the past 30 years has been based on the widespread adoption of treatments that were studied only at the large group level. So in other words, we might study 1,000 people, and we would know that a treatment was beneficial for a minority, for some, but not all. And we would never know what distinguished the group of some from the group of not all. And although on this side, if you can see it, there's a specific reference to pharmacotherapy or medications, this doesn't apply only to drugs. So specific psychotherapies have also been widely adopted in some jurisdictions. And that's terrific. It's important that people have access to psychotherapies. But not all therapies work in the same way. And we need to remember that widespread access to a hammer is not necessarily helpful if what you need is a drill. So this has been our model for clinical trials. And the question is, can we do better, or do we need to do better? And I would suggest to you, and Dr. Chris Wilkes, who I know is here, could reinforce this, that I think we need to do better. So there is some data that over 8 million children in America between the age of 0 and 17 are prescribed psychotropic medications each year. And if we look only at depression, we see that's about 2 million kids. Now, we know that we need probably to expose about 6 children to a medication in order to make 1 additional child better. Now, before you get all, I knew psychiatry was a terrible specialty, before you go there, be aware that a 6-to-1 ratio in medicine is actually really good. And there's a whole host of medications, if any of you are out there taking them, you don't have a 6-to-1 ratio. But if we think about the fact that over 2 million children are prescribed antidepressants, this would suggest to us that about 1.5 million of them have probably derived very little benefit from that exposure. So whether it's a medication, a psychotherapy, a talk therapy, whether it's exercise, a supplement, probiotics, which we'll come to, or a neurostimulation, for us the question is, how do we match our patients with our treatments in the most effective way? And I would suggest that when we ask any parent to expose his or her child to a treatment, whatever that treatment is, that parent and that child has a reasonable expectation that it's going to be worth the risk. And this is why psychiatry needs precision medicine. Now, if we put it all together, we're talking about large collaborative groups, we're talking about new technologies, we're talking about analyzing things in ways that we've never known before, and it has a little box that says this is where the miracle occurs in the analysis section. So you might say to us, well, that's a lot for a field to absorb, and how's that going for you? And I would say that that is a fair question. Psychiatry is used to complexity, and that helps us. And in some ways, this mostly represents a scaling up of what we have tried to do for a long time. It is true, however, that it is a lot of work. And our current academic processes, the way that we have learned to work, they're not always optimized to support large distributed research networks. So this is very much a new way of doing business. And it can feel like we are building the boat at the same time we are trying to stay afloat. But what you're seeing on the screen here is a sampling of some of the papers that have been published over the last couple of years from that ProCan study and from that CanBind study. And if you were able to read them, you would see a few references to our cohorts. You'd see some genetics, some imaging. We've got some treatment in there. So I would suggest to you that maybe we are making some progress. I have one final example just to bring us back full circle to where we started with Descartes. And we started talking about how Cartesian dualism had essentially separated mind and body for a few hundred years. And this evening we've talked so far about examples where we have tried to put the mind back into the brain. Imagine is another big national network that's led out of Calgary and McMaster. They would say McMaster and Calgary, but let's go with Calgary and McMaster. And you can see, if you can see this picture, that we are aiming to connect the brain and the gut and to put the brain finally back into the body. The goal, and if any of you had a chance to see the booth outside, the goal is to recruit 8,000 people, including a number with inflammatory or irritable bowel disease, and to understand how having these illnesses in the gut can actually change the brain, to understand how changes in the brain that come with depression, stress, or anxiety can influence what happens in the gut. Now, we've been working on this for a long time. And if this slide has a kind of retro, late 80s, early 90s feel, that would be about right. But I want to acknowledge that this is something we've thought of for many years. And in fact, I mentioned very briefly that I had done a PhD in behaviorism. But what I actually focused on in my PhD was whether or not we could classically condition, and that's Pavlov ringing the bell with his dog. So whether we could classically condition a mast cell, which is an immune cell sitting here on the kind of inside of the gut, whether we could condition that mast cell to release chemicals. And we trained rats in something that the immunologists called your disco chamber, because we had rats in a little chamber that we flashed certain lights at them and there were certain sounds. But in that chamber, we essentially trained the rat in such a way that when we exposed it to a cue, there was, in fact, evidence that these mast cells far out of the brain, way down in the gut, would degranulate in response to that cue. So even 30 years ago, we thought that these connections were important. And you will also note, John especially, even back then, we were recognizing the importance of the gut bacteria or the microbiome. And I'm not sure whether any of you can see this, but this is actually 2005, a cartoon from the Globe and Mail, where a waiter is offering a patron a little dash of probiotics on his dinner. Now, probiotics have certainly come into the mainstream. How many people have ever tried one? Be honest. How many have thought about it? Lots of people. So that's an interesting phenomenon, because our current enthusiasm for these preparations is really exceeded only by the size of the gap in our knowledge about how and when we should aim to manipulate our intestinal flora. But it's an important question. It's obviously a question that's hit the mainstream, and it's a question that we're hoping to start to answer with Imagine. So we will use a whole host of technologies that are available to us to look at dietary factors, the microbiome, the ways in which these influence inflammation in the periphery, here mostly the gut, and the impact of those on the brain and psychiatric disease. So this is precision medicine with the brain, body, and bugs fully integrated. Now that brings us full circle to our friend Descartes. And in 1649, he wrote The Passions of the Soul, largely as a synthesis of the letters he exchanged with Princess Elizabeth. And in the Passions, he finally acknowledged that mind and body exist in synergy, each dependent on the other. And I'll just read this. Our soul and body are so linked that once we have joined some bodily action with a certain thought, neither of them will occur again except accompanied by the other. And for a little dash of the personalized medicine, and which actions are joined with which thoughts varies from person to person. We are very privileged in Calgary to have access to remarkable technology and the technologies that will allow us to drive the field forward. But as we've discussed, technology alone will not create the future of health. Progress relies on collaboration and a cultural willingness to change. It's the classic Drucker line that culture will eat your strategy for breakfast. So we are also incredibly fortunate to have a university that is committed to creating that culture that supports change. And what will ultimately shift the way that our broader community understands psychiatric illness is the fact that you are all here with us this evening. Thank you so much for being part of this.
Okay, well, thank you, Glenda, for an incredibly interesting and inspiring presentation. I guess I should personally thank Nikita for making my role in psychiatric research entirely obsolete. If anyone has noticed, we have a couple of microphones set up in the audience. Glenda's kindly offered to answer questions for about 20 minutes, so if anyone's interested and has anything they'd like to ask, please make your way up to the mic. We just ask that we keep things as concise as possible so as many people as we can get a chance to speak. And before you ask your question, just introduce yourself so we all know how to refer to you. So we'll give everyone a second to head to the mics and go from there. We'll see. I'll just let you pick your people and go back and forth between mics.
Is this on? No.
It is on.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Sally. Sorry, at the very last discussion on probiotics, so I think what you were saying, if I heard you correctly, is the jury is out. We don't know if they're effective or not at this point until you do the research?
Yes, so there's, it's a kind of a fascinating, to me, cultural experience, because there is a very, or quite a large body of preclinical or animal research. And much of that work does suggest that probiotics could be beneficial for a variety of conditions. So that's compelling, but there's a real paucity or absence of human clinical trials to date, a very small number. For some conditions like irritable bowel syndrome, there's a reasonable, although limited body of literature, and then for others, it's almost absent. And I just want to take that opportunity to point out that Val Taylor is one of the only people, I think, in Canada who's actually really looking at the issue of the gut microbiome for conditions like depression and anxiety. So obviously, we're lucky to have her here.
Hi, my name's Rolf. Can you talk about the research going on for treatment-resistant depression using psychedelics and what the mechanism is that makes it, might make it work?
Yeah. So to a great extent, we don't know. And there was interest in that field way back when in the 1960s, and some of it got a bad reputation back then. Probably what's led to renewed interest has been the finding in the last few years that ketamine, or special K, but ketamine can have very rapid antidepressant properties for a subset of people. And when we look at the mechanism of action for ketamine, it's turned a few things that we thought we knew on its head, because it's a new series of neurotransmitters. And prior to the data on ketamine, we had generally thought that high levels of something called glutamate were probably excitotoxic or bad. But ketamine causes glutamate release and yet has these very profound, for some people, antidepressant effects. So I think that's led to a renewed interest in what about some of these other compounds that can have these sort of psychedelic or psychosis-inducing properties. But for the most part, the jury is out on the underlying mechanism of action.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you very much.
Hello, I am Basim. I am the Graduate Students Association Vice President Student Life. My question is a little bit technical about the algorithm that you used to decrease the amount of time needed to have a scans. Is that like a machine learning? What kind of machine learning?
Yeah.
Neural network technique?
Yes.
Exactly. Can you emphasize on that, please?
Just a little bit. So it's a convolutional neural network. And one of the interesting things about how this field is going was it was developed by a group who tested it and trained it on about 25,000 samples of hippocampus, of scans that had the hippocampus. So they're in the public domain. They used 25,000 to train up this neural network, and then they published on it, but they also released it essentially freely into the internet. And so, Nikita it was a fair bit of work to get it locally configured, but we were able to obtain it from the internet. So yes, it is a neat example of a kind of a machine learning advanced.
Thank you a lot.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Dr. MacQueen. My name is Cherie, and I just have a question about this slide about children being medicated in the States. And I'm just wondering what kind of effect it has on children, especially because we're giving it so young now, and especially if there is no actual, or there eventually is no clinical depression, what that has on youth.
Yeah, I think those are good questions, and we are slowly, but with stunning kind of slowness, acquiring data on young people. And so much of what we've known or thought we knew about pharmacotherapy has been what we've extracted downward from adult studies. And just for an example, adolescent depression, for children to have a full-on depression pre-pubertally is quite unusual, but it's not so unusual in the post-pubertal or adolescent phase. And that's when depression often starts, as we've been talking about. But so you might think that it would be a reasonable thing to do some studies, some good quality trials on whether or not antidepressants work in adolescence. And if you look for high quality trials, there are virtually 2 in the published literature. There's one called TADS, there's one called Tordia. And we just very recently reviewed that literature with some of my colleagues at MAC, and we just got the paper accepted. But the sad part was we said, well, it's time to do an update of the literature, and there are no more high quality trials to include. So unfortunately, I think we don't know. We don't know what the short-term effect is always, and we don't know what the long-term effect is. But it's a really valid question because clearly we're exposing developing brains to chemicals that might be protective, but they might not be.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenda. My name is Chris Wilkes.
I know Chris.
I have, well, first let me say thank you very much for a very eloquent and comprehensive presentation. With your reference to children and the risk factors for depression, I wondered if you have any information about the impact of increasing face time on hippocampal function and the issue of whether it may even be protective in some cases, let alone a risk factor.
Yeah. You can probably answer that question as well, probably better than I can. And I think for most of us, it's speculation. There has certainly been a fair bit written about how as screen time is going up, there's been questions about our rates of depression also going up. Our colleague Scott Patton, I think, has some data to suggest in university students, maybe not particularly, but I think we don't know, and it may be a risk factor. But there have been other people who have provided that contrary voice to suggest that maybe for some young people who may be struggling to develop a social network, particularly if they just don't see themselves as fitting into their peer groups in school or other activities, the ability to connect online might have some protective features. But I think the jury's still out. And the other thing I would say about that, and I think I've seen it in my children, and I see it in the children of my colleagues, even 5 to 10 years is a long time for these technologies. So my kids who are here, they kind of grew up in the era of online, but kids who are 4, 5, and 6 these days are having a completely different experience with online technology than even you guys did 10 years or so ago. So I think if we're looking at adolescents today, I'm not even sure that we can predict what's going to happen with our kids who are really, the under 10 crowd in a few years.
Mary Valentich, and I'm a professor emerit in the Faculty of Social Work. And I mention this because then you'll know where my question's coming from. I appreciate the incredible complexity of the research you're doing, and I know depression itself is very complex, obviously. But I'm just wondering, who do you do research with or collaborate or link to deal with the social conditions that we have, like poverty? We know how serious that is. So how do you, who do you hang out with, in a sense, to try to deal with what are some of the underlying social conditions?
Yeah. So, as you know, that is a whole area, and most of our teams have either psychologists or other professionals who have expertise in psychosocial factors, and we nearly always are careful to collect the best data we can on everything from family functioning, kind of the kind of socioeconomic situation of the family and the child. We look for early trauma. We have experts for one of our Kanban projects. We actually have some very detailed questions about early experiences that are done only by an expert group at Queen's. So they do them by phone so that everybody in the country is approached in the same way with a kind of high quality approach to assessing that information. One of the other things that I would say, which is not meant to sidestep that question, but I think Alberta has been really fortunate because, I have a bias, admittedly,